Hi guys, it's Blackie. Okay, in the percussion revolver series, I think a question I get asked at least once a week is about brass revolvers. So let's go a little more in depth. I've talked about this in the past, but I'll go a little deeper this time, okay? Why brass? Okay, back in the flintlock era, early naval guns, a lot of them would have a brass body because brass does not tarnish in the saltwater environment. Now, barrels could be clean because they were tubes. You know, you could run up and down, you could find ways to keep the moisture out. But an action on the outside of it and the working parts inside was kind of difficult to clean. And you really didn't want your privates and things taking the guns completely apart because they'd lose springs, whatever, and you'd quickly end up with an Army or a Navy patrol that didn't have any functioning weapons. And you could read a lot of the military accounts of those days of where guns went out and every man had a functioning gun, and then when they returned, how many guns were actually functioning because of broken parts, missing parts, something wore off. They were tough on their guns, okay? The environment was very tough, so brass made sense. Step forward until the Civil War time period. It was because the South simply did not have enough steel. The industrial capacity was all in the North. The South was the agricultural powerhouse that produced the money, really. The three richest states on the beginning of the Civil War were Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. But we didn't have the industrial complex down here. And so it was a real hard-fought thing trying to find any kind of resources down here to create firearms. And brass could be made from church bells and other large brass bronze things that were very popular in those days for ornaments and everything else. And so beds were made out of brass and bronze, and so they'd be, red frames, bells, ornamental this, whatever, could be melted down. And they use that extensively. But the problem with brass is it doesn't hold up that well. And the problem with brass is the fact that it's a very soft metal and it would deform easy. And so that's where we historically get the pictures of the brass frame 51 Navy and the brass frame Dragoon type guns, except for 1860 Army. The ones that did exist in the past, okay? There are many, many more in modern time that never existed historically. Now this is a brass frame 51 Navy N44 caliber. Such a gun never existed. There was, yes, one prototype made where Colt took a steel frame, created a rebellious cylinder, and bored it out to 44 caliber. That was a prototype that led to the 1860 Army. Could you put a Dragoon caliber onto a belt pistol is what they're doing. But even then that was a steel frame. Colt never made a brass frame gun. Because Colt was in the North and they had steel resources. Now, where these guns really got a bad rep was in the 1960s, late 1960s, after the centennial anniversary of the Civil War, and so many Civil War reenactments had popped up all over the country. It was a huge tourist thing. It was like a national thing. And because of that, so many of these places were doing reenactments. The problem with it is there was only so many of the original guns left around to do the reenactments with. True, it had been 100 years, and there were, by today's standard, quite a lot. But not enough, And so Val Forget, who was the head of Navy Arms, went to Italy and got them to reproduce the 51 Navy. And not long after that, there was some 51 Navies in brass and, for the Confederate side, that type deal. And many of those guns in those early days in the late 1960s through the 1970s were junk. I'll tell you straight up, they were junk. Dead soft brass sometimes. And if you go back and look at a lot of the gun magazines from the 70s, somewhere in the back in the advertisements, there'll be this little ad. And it'll be a 51 Navy brass frame, 36 caliber, $49. I saw that a lot in the 70s. By the 80s, it went up to $79. And those guns were being created over there in Italy, but for the vast majority of it, it was meant for shooting blanks. Yes, it looked like a 51 Navy, and it took apart like a 51 Navy, but it had not been manufactured like Colt had. That meant it didn't have a forcing cone worth of flip up here. And when you look down the barrel, the rifling was sticking up in the forcing cone. It wasn't tapered. They were horrible shooters. And you go back and look at the targets that was for the National Muzzleloading Rifle Association in the 1960s. The 25-yard black powder pistol target, it was a bullseye. I mean, the bullseye was a lot bigger than a basketball, you know, because they didn't expect the guns to be able to hit hardly anything. And so a lot of times they'd have, you know, 5 guys, and at 15 yards out or 20 yards out, they would put up a piece of plywood, and they'd put so many clay pigeons on it. And they had to shoot, they busted all the clay pigeons, and it was a duel. This 5 guys versus that 5 guys. And they would go, a lot of guys shooting for several minutes before they busted all 20 or 25 of those clay pigeons, even though everybody had 5 shots each. And there was like 10 guys shooting. It's because they were all over the place. Those early guns were not well made at all. They were meant for a noisemaker. They were meant for the Civil War reenactor. And that's where a lot of the brass got the reputation of just being junk, because I will wholeheartedly agree that a lot of those guns back in that day were junk. And it was simply because they were not being made for that price point. Now by the 90s, all that had to change because cowboy action came into the scene. And you had to be able to shoot competitively. And you see a massive change in the quality of the guns, both brass and steel guns, because they've got to be able to be competitive. Otherwise, why even sell it? The emphasis is now not so much on the blank firing Civil War reenactor or even the Western reenactor, but more now toward the shooting sport where you actually got to hit a target at speed. So it's got to be reliable, it's got to be accurate, and it's got to work well. If it doesn't, so you Berti, Pieta, San Marco, and them, they had to step up their game quite a bit. Now, that brings us to the modern time. And the modern time is these are actually pretty dang good revolvers as far as the percussion guns go. Now, let us be clear when we're talking about this. The steel cylinder is the same on the brass and on the steel frame. The barrel is the same on both of them. They're completely interchangeable. The wedge is the same. The hammer is the same, etc. The only thing different is the frame. So if this had a steel frame in it, we still have a brass back strap, brass trigger guard, this cylinder, this hammer, etc. That's the only component that's different. And they don't make 2 kinds of barrels or 2 kinds of cylinders. You don't have to say I've got a brass gun to get a cylinder. They're interchangeable. So the only difference is the frame. So why does this stigma of the guns shooting out so quickly happen? Those $49 specials from back in the 70s. They absolutely did. I personally bought one. And I can attest the fact that in less than 500 rounds, that gun had shot loose. And what I mean is loose. It wouldn't reliably go off because the gap right here had stretched to the point that the cylinder could go so far forward the hammer couldn't reliably set off the caps. I had to put a spacer in between the barrel and the front of the cylinder, a little round piece of tubing, to act as a spacer and keep the cylinder pushed hard back to the back to reliably go off. But that left the cylinder gap up here on the back of the barrel. See? Now, why does this happen? Okay. For a moment, let's imagine that you have a piece of thick plate metal, okay? Say 1/2 inch thick. I screw a 1/2 inch, drill a hole, I thread it, and I put a 1/2 inch thick, 6 inch long bolt into here. Cinch it up blood tight. Now on the end of that bolt, I hit it with a hammer with considerable force, several hundred pounds PSI. Bam, 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 bam. How long until where that bolt goes into that plate, that threading, how long until it distends out from the impact? It stretches, so to speak. How hard, how fast, etc. That's your variable. That's exactly what's happening here, because we have a steel base pin screwed into it's not actually brass, it's gunmetal, it's an alloy, but we're going to call it brass for this. So you've got a steel screwed into a brass. Those two metals have completely different properties. If you take steel and heat it up cherry red and then quench it, you harden it. If you heat up steel cherry red and you let it air cool slowly, you soften it. Brass is 180 degrees. If you take it and you heat it up and you quench it, you make it dead soft. If you heat it up and let it cool slowly, it's harder. And if you work harden it, that means beat on it, brass gets harder and harder. It compresses and it gets harder. Little pin. So, my neighbor's dog just come up and said hello. And you got to turn over everything. Now, back to you. Go find you a chipmunk. Yep, go find you a chipmunk. Pin comes over to hunt chipmunks. Okay. You've got the bolt coming into that thing, into that brass. And the brass becomes work hardened by the impact. At the same moment, the steel, which is a completely different property, is more elastic than the brass. And upon firing, what you have happening is here. The chamber ignites and the pressure, the ball hits the barrel. The barrel, due to the fact of the force hitting it with that ball, and that ball's trying to force itself due to friction, is trying to pull this way, away. At the same moment, the cylinder is being driven backwards by the pressure, so they're going in opposite directions right here. Right there where that cylinder gap is supposed to be is where the stretch occurs, because that steel base pin is going to stretch. It's going to elastically stretch and then come back. And so it's going womp, 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 womp. On a high speed enough camera, you can actually see it stretch. That's the reason when you see somebody on a really slow camera, even with a very tight cylinder gap, and they fire and there's this huge flash right there at the top. That's because that barrel is going away due to that elasticity of steel, it coming out, and the steel returns. But the brass doesn't. The brass is becoming hardened. So at point X, the back of the receiver has been hammered, and therefore hammer work, so it's harder and slightly dense, and the tolerance is a little bit deeper. And the barrel has stretched this, the base pin has stretched this way, and the threading, where it is screwed together, has elongated to the front. You see what I'm saying? The two have pulled apart. That is what's termed shot loose. There's a bigger gap between this two. Your next question, Blackie, can that be fixed? Technically, yes. How could that be done? Well, you could take the frame out, completely out of the gun. It could be chucked up into a vertical milling machine. They could come in and mill out the entire area inside where that ring is, where the teeth go. Thread it with a flat end mill, come in and screw a hardened disc into it under pressure, so that they would bind in some sort of binding agent, like J.B. Weld, to lock the two together and have a much bigger surface area in the brass as opposed to just the threading into the brass. And you could return the gun to proper tolerance and length that way. But that's going to cost you a whole lot more than a new gun, because these are the economical starting guns. They're meant to be cheaper because the less milling operations and creation operations to do a steel frame is a cost savings, so they can pass that on to you, so you can pick these up a lot of times on sale for $200 or less. you're going to probably pay $500 to have a machinist who knows what he's doing and do a really good job to do what I just described, how to take a brass frame gun and get it shooting like it's supposed to again. It's cheaper to buy another gun. But today, with the modern cowboy action, these brass frames are a lot better than they used to be. The quality of the metal is much better. You do not hear nearly as much about some guns shooting loose. Now, I want you to also consider this. You know them Henry Golden Boy rifles? Same metal. That's not brass, that's gunmetal number 6. And so that Henry Golden Boy and 357 and 44 Magnum and 45 Colt and 45-70, that Golden Boy, have you heard anybody talking about a Golden Boy shooting loose? That's a $700 gun. Well, yeah, it's a bigger receiver, yeah, but it's the same metal. It's still a steel barrel screwing into a brass-like frame. Wouldn't that work the same way? And there's a whole lot more horsepower in a 45-70 than there is in a cap and ball revolver, little old 36. But I haven't heard anybody hollering about their brass frame Henry shooting loose, shooting heavy 45-70 loads, nor have I heard any big warnings of don't shoot anything but anemic little weak loads in any of those rifles. So they must have done something to the alloy to improve it, right? So here's my advice. If you want to get one of the brass frame guns because they're more economical, you're just starting to get into cap and ball revolvers, and I'd like to try this out, yeah, absolutely go with it. How long will it shoot? There's no way of knowing. I have a friend who shoots in cowboy action a lot. He's retired. That's what he does just about all the time. And he's shooting, I asked him if one of his brass frames had shot loose, and he said that he'd already put right at 2,000 rounds through it. That was a Berti, I believe, brass frame. He said he already put 2,000 rounds through it. And yes, you could see a little bit of a gap, but it was nowhere near shot out, and that's been 2,000 rounds. For a gun that costs $200 on sale, that's a good investment right there. So my advice is get the guns if that's what you can afford. Go out and shoot it, learn from it, you know. And when you finally do shoot it loose, 5 years, 10 years, or the rest of your life, because of the amount of time you shoot, how heavy a load, and etc. And we'll talk about the load in a second. Get another one. Better yet, take the one that you just shot out. How many people can say, I wore out a gun? Not I sold a gun, I wore out a gun. Okay? Find a Civil War reenactor that wants a noisemaker like I did. They don't care if it flashes, they're just shooting blanks, and that's a whole lot less wear and tear on the gun as a blank, because there's no ball pressures, thrust head pressures that's trying to go down the barrel, it's just blowing down a tube. And so those guns last forever. So that'd be a way to go. Now, talking about load. Again, back whenever the Valve Forge, Dixie Gun Works, EMF, and all of them that were the first ones that were out in the 70s, whenever I got involved in it, a lot of the information that was out there about all you could find was in the Dixie Gun Works catalog. And I have Dixie Gun Works catalogs from the 70s and a modern Dixie Gun Works catalog, and you can look at the descriptions. They've never changed the description. And so when they talked about shooting 10 to 15 grains in a brass frame revolver so it wouldn't shoot loose, they were talking about them $49 ones. They're not talking about the modern ones, but they never changed the write-up. They've never updated it. It's the same wording that they had 40 years ago, 50 years ago in some cases. And so because of that, we still have that persona that these guns are just, you know, peanut butter soft and they're just going to come apart the first time you pull the trigger on them. And that's not the case. My friend that I told you about got 2,000 rounds, he's shooting 25, 30 grains in it. He, like me, he shoots, you know, not necessarily full bore, but a full charge in it. He wants the ball up near the mouth for best accuracy. He's not putting any filler in it. He shoots powder and wonder wad, about 30 grains, I think, in his 45s, like mine, 30-something grains of wonder wad in a ball, and the 36s are going to be somewhere in like 25. And that's what he shoots. The guns will hold up in the long run like that, but eventually, the guns will eventually, due to that metal to metal variance, eventually develop a bigger gap. And if you've got that much time and effort in it, where it's an old keepsake that you just can't bear to part with, yeah, find a machinist to do the work for you. Bring it back. On the other hand, just go get another one. Take it, put it up on the shelf in a place of honor to say, hey, this was my friend a lot of years. Look how many rounds. Think of all the matches, how many camping trips, whatever. It becomes a keepsake then. You know? Certain things are going to accelerate it. And one of the things that's going to accelerate it is full charges, heavy conicals. I do not recommend shooting heavy conicals in the brass frame revolvers because it's much more pressure and thrust and stress. Kato Ojama's bullets are great hunting bullets, and I highly recommend them as a hunting bullet. I do not recommend them for a brass frame. Certainly not a steady diet of it, because they're harder to load. That's putting more torque and pressure, because when you're using the loading lever, you're flexing that same pressure, remember. Although I'm doing this, I'm trying to pull the frame and barrel apart. That's the camming lever action. So putting a big heavy conical bullet in there that's hard to force in. Have you ever heard about somebody bending the rammer? I have. Seen them broken off a lot, where people are trying to take an oversized bullet and force it in there. You know, it puts a whole lot more thrust when it tries to push it down the barrel as well. So sticking to round ball, sticking to a reasonable charge, shooting it for enjoyment, and if it just really just bothers you, you just can't get over it, go ahead and spend the money and buy the steel frame. That's my 2 cents worth, guys. I own brass frame guns, I own steel guns. I shoot a lot of both. I enjoy the both of them, and hopefully you will too. Hope this gives you some ideas, guys. Please leave any questions or comments below. Until next time, I'm Blackie, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.